Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to East Central Missouri and the world, and welcome to the James Strong Show podcast number 252. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for making us a part of your day. I appreciate it. This podcast was recorded on the evening of Wednesday, January the 26th, from the James Strong Studio in Western St. Charles County, a Wednesday evening podcast. When's the last time I did something like that? It's hard to say. It's been a long time. I've also got guests on this time. It's been a long time since I've had a guest on the podcast, probably about 3 or 4 weeks. And it's been a really long time since I've had these two on the podcast. Welcome to the James Strong Podcast, Joe Schaper and Eugene Vale. How are you two doing?
We're hanging in there.
We're doing fine, James.
I wanted to have you two on, and especially you, Joe, because I guess you're more, you kind of run the show up at the St. Clair Historical Society, and Eugene Historical Museum. Thank you, Eugene. You help out there, but it's kind of Joe's ballywick, more hers than yours. But I wanted to have you two on because you did a special exhibit, and when I first heard about this, I thought, what? I didn't even know this existed, and it had to do with Black families who settled in the St. Clair area and in Franklin County. I didn't know there was such a thing. Talk to me about this.
Okay, I will give the overview for this. And that is many years ago, not like a lot of years ago, but the museum burned in 2014. Before that, in 2013, I went to the museum to interview somebody about the mining in the area. Mm-hmm. And I noticed that they had a small exhibit about the Black community in St. Clair, and this includes Londell, Robertsville, Moselle, and an area called Derry, which is over near Union. It wasn't just strictly in St. Clair, mm-hmm. and didn't think much about it. In 2020, after the George Floyd killing, one of the young ladies who was from St. Clair, Alexandria Gray, organized many protests throughout Franklin County. She is of mixed heritage, and her thing was basically being part Black and being from the area. She wanted to, bring this home to folks, that it wasn't just a city thing. It wasn't just somewhere else. Mm-hmm. Well, one of the protests they had was on Main Street in St. Clair, and we were up there that day and noticed two things. One, most of the protesters out in the street, they had their permits, and all they did was pretty much, be out there and talk real loud and be upset. It was very nonviolent, and it was very informative.
Just calling attention.
Right. And noticed that of the people who were doing the protesting, probably three-fifths of the people out there were what you or I might call Black or African American. The other 2/5 were white. Mm-hmm. And there were an awful lot of little children who were obviously biracial. Mm-hmm. And I was sitting in the museum thinking, if they come in the door, we don't have anything about the Black people from around this area. Mm-hmm. And I know that families exist because, in fact, the lady who is kind of the lead on putting the exhibit together, her name is Netley Clay. She and her cousin, Patricia Bowers, Patricia Bowers, they work in town, and I had known Netley when I was working for the newspaper out there, so she wasn't a stranger. Anyway, we've been trying to get her to come back to the museum because she had actually worked on the exhibit in the prior museum. Carla Wolfers, who is the president, managed to, basically sweet-talked Netley into coming back to the museum as a member, and told her, if you want to put out an exhibit on African American history, feel free. Our museum is your museum, and Netley and Pat pretty much ran with it. This came up like in November, and she said, we'd like to do this for January 15th for Dr. King's birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going, oh my God, because normally an exhibit like this would take, it would take months and months to get together. But we sort of ran with the flow here, and it is a big deal. It is a lot of the personal collections of Netley and her cousin Pat. But after this big exhibit is over, we are going to maintain a Black History exhibit, which is pretty much concentrated on the families who have been there for
now for those of you who are listeners who aren't from this area. Franklin County, the area of St. Clair, Londell, Robertsville. This is probably, 45 miles southwest of St. Louis, give or take?
40 miles southwest.
40 miles southwest of St. Louis. So this is the area we're talking about. This isn't even the suburbs. It's a county or two away from the city of St. Louis. And you mentioned the lady's last name is Clay. And something else that was very interesting I found is that Ms. Clay has some very influential relatives in the St. Louis area.
Yes, actually, the Clay family is one of the people who are featured in here. Bill Clay Sr. It was actually the first U.S. representative from the state of Missouri who was of African American heritage, and after he retired, then his son Lacey Clay also took he was at was First District North until this last election, at which point he was defeated by Corey Bush.
Right, and Bill Clay was elected in the early '60s, if I remember correctly. So they've been in control for a long time, or had been.
It would have been the later '60s, early '70s.
Okay.
But I worked on an exhibit at the State Museum that had pictures of him from the Jefferson Bank protests in St. Louis, which was kind of where he got his political start.
Mm-hmm.
The interesting thing is we had to go through the genealogy and who was father and son to whom. And back in the 1800s, there was a William Clay and there was a Squire Lacey Clay. So
really?
Those two names have been around in Franklin County for a lot longer than the people in St. Louis knew about this.
Really? Amazing.
The one thing that I said earlier before we were on the air about the heritage of African Americans in Franklin County, in the 1830s, the county was actually first settled by people from Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, not the deep South, but kind of the Appalachian South.
Okay.
And they brought their slaves with them. And at that point in the 1830s, there were 1/3 of the county were enslaved people, most of whom were African American. In 1860, the state did what is called the slave schedule, in which they counted all of the slave owners and all of the enslaved people. And by that time, the county had slaves in the county had dwindled to 10% of the population of the county. And it wasn't so much that anyone had left, is that all of the Germans who immigrated in during the 1840s and 1850s, they did not have slaves.
So it wasn't so much the slave population, the black population had decreased. It's just that the non-slave population, the white population, had increased.
Exactly.
Okay.
And by the 2020 census, it was because the census is interesting, the recent census, because it includes people who claim to be African American and people who are two or more races,
Mm-hmm.
and then you could write down which ones they were. And there were approximately 5% of the population of 104,000 of Franklin County now claim an African American heritage.
So there's been an African American, what do I want to say, presence in Franklin County for a long, long time. And with
it may even go back to the French bringing in and starting the first mining, but that might be a stretch.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, go ahead.
Well, the first mining in the county, which was in the 1830s at Virginia Mines, yes, they did bring in slaves to do the actual digging.
You have a story, and I believe that was a story out of the Missourian that you sent to me about one of the slaves that his owner allowed him to work in the mines during his off hours so he could earn money, and so he could buy the freedom for his family.
Yeah, it's actually, this fellow is kind of the paterfamilias to most of the people who are in the clay, generally bland, and what's the other one, Eugene?
Inge Beasley.
Right. Anyway, he's kind of the father of way back in the years, but Isaac Renfro was brought from Kentucky as a slave. He also had the owner, and the owner's name is unclear, but the owner also had a white son who was a friend, and when Isaac came, he was pretty much still a boy, and he and his what he called his white brother, they got along famously.
Mm-hmm.
But Isaac Renfro, according to the story, which is in the museum, and we've got one of his great-great-grandsons telling it, is he had a dream. He was working as a farm laborer, and he had a dream that there was some place on the place where he lived that there was a lead strike. Mm-hmm. And he apparently went out on his own time and, dug around a little. And yes, he found a lead deposit. And he supposedly, he dug at it a little bit, and then he said, I better cover this all up. He says, because I don't own this land. He says, I don't even own myself. So he went and talked to his owner, and their slaves were allowed to basically have a day of rest on Sunday. They were expected to go to church, but
mm-hmm.
then Sunday afternoon was off. And he said, if I dig this myself, can I, get the proceeds and basically free myself? And the owner said yes. Well, as it turned out, the first person he freed was his daughter, and then his wife. And he was working on paying for himself when emancipation came. The owner went to Isaac and said, you're free. You don't have to keep paying me money. And he says, no. He says, I told you I was going to pay for myself, and I did, and I will. So part of the payment for his freedom came after the emancipation for the state, which was on January 11th, 1865. Slaves in Missouri were not freed in 1863 because we were a border state, and if you were in a border state, that did not apply. Anyway, after that, what he did, he pretty much remained on the place where he was at. He would take the lead that he dug, give it to his owner's son, who would take it into town, into St. Clair, and St. Clair at that point was famous because they did a lot of barter. You could take a pail of lead in there and, buy dry goods and groceries. So they apparently ran a tab on the left.